Good afternoon and welcome to the Kirby Center. Our guest today is the executive editor for the National Review, as well as a contributing editor to The Atlantic and National Affairs. He is the son of Bangladeshi immigrants, born and raised in New York. He has appeared on numerous radio and television programs, including NPR, HBO, BBC's Newsnight, and Fox News' Tucker Carlson Tonight. Our guest is the co-author of Grand New Party and the solo author of his new book, Melting Pot or Civil War. Please join me in welcoming Reihan Salam.
Thanks very much to Matt and Joe for that very warm introduction. And thanks to all of you in the Hillsdale community for welcoming me. It's a true honor. I've had the pleasure of speaking at the Kirby Center once before, and it was a great pleasure, and I'm sure this will be exactly the same. So I am doing something very unusual. Normally when I give talks, I try to wing it. I fly by the seat of my pants so as to keep a sense of thrill and excitement, where you think that, maybe I will fall off my high wire at any given moment. But this time I thought, you know what? Why not actually write something out? So please forgive me. I might, with my voice, slowly put you to sleep. Do your best. Pinch your cheeks. Just do whatever it is you need to do to stay awake and come on this wild journey with me. We all know Donald Trump wants a border wall, which he sees as the first line of defense against future waves of unauthorized migration from south of the Rio Grande. We also know that Democrats in Congress don't want a border wall, which they see as a hateful symbol of exclusion and bigotry. There's much to be said about the politics of the border wall and whether or not it would make a meaningful, cost-effective contribution to controlling migration flows. Before we get there, though, I want to discuss a less concrete subject, which I would argue lies beneath all of the shouting over the wall. What does it mean to be an American? It's a question where there is, as I'm sure you've noticed, lively disagreement. And it's this disagreement that has made the politics of immigration so unbelievably contentious. I see questions about Americanness as questions about the content of our nationalism. A lot of the time, people use the term nationalism to denote an ideology. Say, a belief in the superiority of one nation over all others, or a commitment to ethnic chauvinism and militarism. The sociologist Bart Bonakowski uses a different definition, which I found helpful. To Bonakowski, nationalism simply refers to the complex of ideas, sentiments, and representations by which Americans understand the United States and their relationship to it. Different conceptions of what it means to be an American amount, in this sense, to different nationalisms. Tonight, I'll introduce two different, clashing American nationalisms with an eye towards thinking through their implications for America's immigration policy. For most of American history, the United States has been closely identified with its English-speaking European origin majority. This majority has evolved and expanded over time, and there is much more to say about that. For now, suffice it to say that most of those who belong to this majority have felt they could celebrate the US and its achievements without hesitation. You could say that members of this majority feel a sense of ownership. They see America as their country. The same couldn't always be said for all Americans, as there have always been those who've felt something other than fully American, as something apart from, even excluded from, the mainstream majority. Consider African Americans who've experienced discrimination or who've heard stories of ancestors who suffered grave injustices. There's often a sense that their unique historical experiences separate them from some of their countrymen. This isn't always true, to be sure, but notions of racial loyalty can at times be in tension with an uncomplicated sense of national loyalty. Think back to Muhammad Ali, a proud native of Louisville, Kentucky, who died as a beloved all-American figure, yet who lived a life stoked in controversy. For one, he refused to fight in the Vietnam War on the grounds that it was, according to him at the time, a white man's war. One of the reasons Barack Obama's successful 2008 presidential campaign proved so inspiring to many blacks is that it seemed to promise a kind of reconciliation. Though Obama couldn't right every wrong, he could bring African Americans, in ways large and small, into the heart of the American story. American nationalism could belong to blacks and to other non-white Americans, but the nationalism advanced by Obama was of a distinctive kind. Back in 2016, the political analyst Jamel Bouie, writing in Slate, perfectly distilled the Obama brand of nationalism, describing it as an expression of pluralistic nationalism and deep civic pride, a progressive patriotism that acknowledges the nation's failures but strives to overcome them. Of course, not all love of country takes this particular form. It is true that for many on the left, the only decent form of nationalism is a nationalism that amounts to a celebration of the ongoing American struggle to overcome injustice and to implement various social reforms. But for many other Americans, nationalism is something more akin to the love of one's family. It is a celebration of our shared cultural inheritance and a belief that we owe more to our fellow countrymen than we do to the rest of humanity. In his book, Strangers in Our Midst, David Miller, a political theorist at Oxford, argued that national identity can foster a sense of solidarity that goes well beyond the standard civic duties of paying your taxes, staying out of trouble, and minding your own business. People feel emotionally attached to one another because they share this identity, writes Miller. Their association becomes deeper because the political community conceives of itself as extended in time, indeed, often as reaching back into antiquity. This also means that the obligations it creates stretch backward and forward. They can be inherited from the past and owed to future generations. But what happens in a diverse nation like ours, where a history of enslavement and segregation separates blacks from whites? And what happens when the cultural character of the nation-state changes due to mass immigration? What happens is that we get clashing conceptions of the nation, which are constantly competing with each other. Eric Kaufman, a sociologist at Birkbeck College and the author of an important new book called White Shift, argues that there is no such thing as a single, universally embraced national identity in any society. Rather, different individuals see the symbolic resources that serve as the foundations for national identity, language, history, religious beliefs, shared ancestry, and so on, through different ideological lenses. Over time, socially liberal individuals have sought to redefine national identity as civic and multicultural, which is to say, as less tied to a particular ethnocultural community or to shared ancestry, and more tied to certain political values, such as adherence to liberal democratic norms or a fondness for cultural diversity. Armed with this understanding of national identity, a person might champion more open immigration policies on the grounds that openness is what we are all about, and that the rejection of openness is itself un-American. One is reminded of the classic Barack Obama line, "That's not who we are." As a country grows more open and inclusive, however, there is often a reaction. According to Kaufman, the increase in diversity caused by high immigration levels can have the effect of making ethnic distinctions more salient. In an age when immigrant inflows are low, or when they are dwarfed by high native birth rates, immigrants are more like seasoning in the stew than they are main ingredients. The native cultural majority can feel relaxed about the presence of a few newcomers, or even indifferent. When inflows are high, or when native birth rates are low, or both, it's an entirely different story. In that case, the rapid rise of immigrant origin ethnic communities can really make you stop and think about difference, and more specifically, about what differentiates your community from the new communities that are growing in your midst. It can lead conservative nationalists to fear that the America of the future won't honor the American past. While elites tend to conceive of their identity in civic terms, most people conceive of their identity in ethnic terms. By ethnic, I don't mean to invoke scary blood and soil nationalism. I just mean that most people think in terms of their inherited cultural traditions. And to use a formulation Laura Ingraham invoked at the Republican National Convention in 2016, they think about where their dead are buried. If you're living in the same country as your parents and your grandparents, the notion that you're really an immigrant because your ancestors weren't here before Columbus might seem pretty absurd. This is why scholars of immigrant assimilation consider the third generation meaningfully different from the first and the second. By the time 3 generations have passed, ties to ancestral homelands are more symbolic than real. For the grandchildren of immigrants, it's really America that is your ancestral homeland, even if you enjoy nothing more than partying hard on St. Patrick's Day. This becomes even clearer when newcomers from different cultures arrive, and they offer a vivid reminder that a third-generation Irish, Italian, Mexican-American and a third-generation Japanese, German, Dutch-American have much more in common with each other than either does with a recent arrival from Bangladesh, my parents' native country. And what about those recent immigrants? As new immigrants arrive, they are typically inclined to embrace less culturally specific conceptions of American national identity, as doing so will mean they won't be expected to surrender the cultural traditions they've brought with them from their homelands. In this sense, at least, they are closely aligned with progressive nationalists. If culturally distinctive immigrants arrive in sufficiently large numbers, however, they can, to reiterate, prompt natives who embrace an ethnocultural conception of nationhood to take their national identity more seriously rather than less. Some will seek to defend their cultural community by calling for limits on immigration and by emphasizing the importance of a common national language and culture. To many Americans, these responses to mass immigration aren't just defensible, they are necessary. I'm sympathetic to these views myself. Nevertheless, members of minority ethnic groups often find them alienating. There's an irony here, of course. Recent immigrants who want to hold on to their cultural traditions actually have a lot in common with majority group members who want to do the same, and who worry about the declining relative influence of their ethnocultural community, or even about its eventual extinction. But this shared desire for cultural continuity plays out differently for recent immigrants and for traditionalist natives. Recent immigrants find themselves in a tacit alliance with people who hold secular or cosmopolitan values rather than with their fellow traditionalists. One wonders if we'll ever see a scrambling of these alliances. Will one conception of national identity eventually vanquish the other? Not a chance. Both have staying power. Conservative nationalists might find progressive nationalism irritating and destructive, but it's not going anywhere. Progressive nationalists might consider conservative nationalism retrograde, if not immoral, but they need to face the fact that it is a permanent feature of the landscape, and while it might wane in some periods, it will wax in others. Why does the persistence of these two conceptions of nationalism matter? On all sorts of issues, this distinction between progressive nationalism and conservative nationalism isn't terribly germane. There are progressive nationalists and conservative nationalists who favor Medicare for all and who oppose it, or who want to hike taxes on the rich, or who want to unleash entrepreneurial energies by slashing red tape. On immigration, though, this distinction is absolutely central, and it makes a compromise exceptionally difficult to hammer out. A progressive nationalism that identifies all that is great in America with political movements like those that champion women's equality, gay rights, and criminal justice reform welcomes cultural change because progressive nationalism is not really rooted in the idea of a shared cultural inheritance. The same can't be said of a conservative nationalism that maintains that the American nation is rooted in a particular language and culture. These different visions of American national identity have been around for ages, but high levels of immigration sharpen the distinctions between them. To those on the left, rising diversity necessitates a further move away from a more culturally specific understanding of what it means to be an American. They see it as dangerously exclusive and divisive. If we are all united by the struggle to overcome our nation's failures rather than by a common culture, it is natural to see unauthorized immigrants as part of a story that stretches back to the civil rights movement, if not to abolitionism. These days, it's not uncommon to hear efforts to deport unauthorized immigrants to efforts to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act in the years prior to the Civil War. This is what I call sanctuary progressivism, or the notion that unauthorized immigrants should be defined not as lawbreakers, but as a vulnerable and oppressed minority in need of protection. If we are united by our shared cultural inheritance, however, it is natural to expect that immigrants embrace the culture that defines the native majority, and that decisions about immigration policy should be made in the interests of the most vulnerable members of our cultural community, not in the interests of outsiders who choose to violate our laws. In short, there is just no way to get an immigration solution that fully realizes the moral historical vision of the conservative nationalists or the progressive nationalists. Even so, I believe there's a compromise to be had. Like all compromises, it will be less than ideal, and it will leave just about everyone at least slightly disappointed. I hope to elaborate on the exact contours of the compromise I have in mind during the question and answer session. Briefly, I want to underscore that the key to a compromise is to bridge this yawning normative divide, to devise a settlement that leaves conservative nationalists and progressive nationalists feeling as though they've been listened to and respected. And to get there, we will have to do at least three things. First, we have to accept that there is going to be some kind of amnesty for some number of unauthorized immigrants. Why is that? 2/3 of the unauthorized immigrant population has been in the country for over 10 years. You have a huge swath of unauthorized immigrant adults who have US citizen children living in the United States. And one thing we've learned in the Trump era is that talk of large-scale deportation of folks who've been in the country for 10 years or more actually reduces support for sensible and sane, controlled immigration. This is a huge political challenge for conservative nationalists. To bring in any number of progressive nationalists, you have to have some settlement of the question of unauthorized immigrants who are long-term residents. Second, we ought to modernize the US immigration system with an eye towards better serving the interests of Americans. Given changing public opinion, it is going to be very difficult to make a case for steep reductions in future immigration levels. But an increased emphasis on skills and language ability is broadly popular, and it particularly speaks to the concerns of conservative nationalists. Third, we need an ambitious program of immigrant integration, one that would ensure immigrants have the resources they need to learn English and to be full participants in the civic and economic life of the nation. Short of such an effort, there is, I fear, a real danger that some of today's immigrants will give rise to a new underclass that sees itself as permanently excluded from the American mainstream. This is a project that could and should appeal to conservative and progressive nationalists alike. Thank you very much. I understand that people have very passionate and strong views about these issues. I have pretty strong views about them myself. But it's really important that we just reckon with the fact that while I myself might be a conservative nationalist, I take that idea of a shared cultural inheritance very seriously. The difficult truth is that my views are not shared by the entire American population. These are views it will be very, very difficult to legislate into existence without acknowledging that bitter and determined opposition on the other side. And that's why somehow reframing this conversation as a way of achieving some kind of civic peace is really, really important. I know I've talked about a lot of different issues, and I welcome any and all of your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for speaking, sir. I know it's a difficult topic, and you and I probably agree beyond the buzzwords on any number of things, but how can we have a legislated amnesty given the failure of the amnesty in the 1980s to solve our problems, and especially when between the Ninth Circuit and the DC Circuit Court we have any number of judges who would be willing to open up a partial amnesty to all kinds of other illegal immigrants, saying that would be unfair and not equal opportunity to block them?
This is a really important question, and first I'm going to talk about the 1986 IRCA amnesty. If you look at the Immigration Reform and Control Act, the basic idea was very similar to the idea that you hear me talking about right now, and that's one reason why people are so reluctant to pursue a similar kind of change. The idea was we are going to introduce stringent interior enforcement measures, and that is going to be the other half. And then we're going to regularize this population that, by the way, wound up being much larger than they originally anticipated for some of the reasons you described. There was rampant fraud and much else. So here's the really key important thing that happened. Back then, there was a very powerful constituency on the political right that opposed workplace enforcement. Workplace enforcement was really central to the idea of IRCA, and workplace enforcement, here's the tricky thing, that ran against the interests of many low-wage employers. That's why workplace enforcement was, from the very beginning, weakened to the point where it was really just a purely pro forma kind of idea. You present a variety of different documents, many of them might be fraudulent, and then we'll just call it a day, right? There wasn't really stringent enforcement, and also there was this other tactic where lots of firms would not hire workers directly, but rather would work through contractors who would take on that legal liability. So that was another way to kind of shield low-wage employers. A couple of things have happened since then that have had a pretty big effect. One is you have a little something called E-Verify. And E-Verify is not perfect, it is not flawless, but is a pretty darn effective workplace enforcement measure. It is so effective, in fact, that you have a lot of folks in that kind of anti-borders lobby who are vigorously resisting efforts to make E-Verify mandatory. And you have some state-level officials, by the way, who have been making it mandatory, and we see that, in fact, mandatory E-Verify is quite effective at deterring the employment of unauthorized folks. And given that many of them are, the vast majority of them are seeking employment, this makes a very, very big difference. So that is one critical difference between now and then. Another big difference is that the American economy has changed since the 1980s. I know that's going to be a big shock to a lot of folks in the room, okay? So one of the big ways it's changed has also had a knock-on effect on the politics of immigration. If you're looking at the 1980s, this was a time when we still had a quite large low-wage, low-skill manufacturing employment base. Since then, that has deteriorated for all sorts of reasons, but the really big reason is offshoring. One way to think about immigration is that immigration is a tool that allows US firms and consumers and employers to gain access to the hard work of talented people from elsewhere in the world. But guess what? Offshoring means, trade means, that you can now partner with workers in other countries without actually importing foreign labor. If you're looking at the iPhone is not built by huge numbers of low-skill, low-wage workers in California or in Michigan. For better or for worse, you have US designers who are working with Chinese workers to produce this amazing product. So I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm simply saying that's a reality, right? And so what's happened is that those manufacturing employers, who used to be a really important constituency for low-wage immigration, they were a really important constituency for resisting workplace enforcement. They're just not there anymore. They might care about high-skill, high-wage employment, but they're not really there for kind of huge inflows of low-skill employment. And one knock-on consequence of that is that the pro-immigration side has become a lot less pragmatic, a lot less oriented around the interests of employers, and a lot more ideological, a lot more based in basically a cosmopolitan ideology which holds that it is presumptively illegitimate to have any kind of immigration control at all. So those are some really, really big changes since 1986, and I believe that if you look at the present, we have the tools to make immigration enforcement far more effective than we did back then. That's one thing. Another thing is that when you're looking at that unauthorized immigrant population in the 1980s, it was quite different. For one, it was very heavily male, which is why you had this big chain migration reaction after people were given legal status. If you're looking at the current population again, 2/3 of that population has been in the country for over 10 years, and a huge amount of it has family ties. A huge part of that current population comes from Mexico. That was also true in the '86 wave. But Mexico is actually aging more rapidly than the United States. If you're looking at future flows of unauthorized migration, they are coming from other places where we have a greater ability to control the flow. For example, through visas. that make it very hard. You can't take a boat from Bangladesh or Senegal to Florida. You just can't do it the way that you can cross the border, right? The way that you can cross the Rio Grande. So these are all things that make the picture a bit different and that I think would make such a bargain more effective. But I'd be happy to talk about this with you further.
Yes, you spent a lot of time talking about what protecting your form of nationalism that you particularly adhere to. My question is broadly about what you think nationalism is, in the context that if you look throughout the world, if you ask people what nationalism is, for example, in Europe, it's very clear what nationalism is because it was born in, after the modern era when it was basically a reaction of ethnic autonomy towards a multicultural or transcultural elite that was broadly hereditary. In the Americas, it's different. Nationalism in the modern era in the Americas is basically people that spoke the same language as the people they were trying to break off from, like in South America or in North America, when English-speaking people were breaking off from Britain. So what exactly to you, what do you think nationalism is? What is the core? You've explained a lot about how you're wanting to protect it. What exactly is the core of what you think American nationalism is? If it's not an ethnic, if it doesn't have an ethnic basis to it.
Thank you very much for that question. You've given me an opportunity to clarify. The point of my talk is that when I'm talking about nationalism, I'm just talking about different people's conceptions of the nation, how they relate to it, how they understand themselves in that context. So for example, my form of nationalism is not universal, which is why I wouldn't say that this is what nationalism is. What nationalism is to me is this idea of a cultural community that has some kind of continued existence. It's this notion that, I was born in 1979, but I am deeply connected to folks who are, kind of earlier eras. When I'm thinking about, English settlers from the 17th century, for example, I feel like they are in line with my cultural inheritance. They are part of me. There are other people for whom that's not their understanding of American life, what it means to them, of their place in American life. Some of them might see the United States as a flag of convenience. It happens that the United States is an affluent, safe, prosperous country, and I happen to live here, but maybe next week I could live in Singapore, or I can live in London or elsewhere. And they might say, gosh, my America is an America that's built around the market and freedom and these various other ideals, and America is really the way I want the world to be. It just happens that we got here first. That's a more ideological conception of what it means to be an American, and that to me is another kind of nationalism. But you're right, other people talk about nationalism in totally different ways, right? Some people say that it's some kind of awful extremism or something like that, or it's simply another word for patriotism. So in this talk, I was using it in a very specific sense to refer to how people make sense of their place in the nation and how they think of the national community. And my point is just that, because you have those different conceptions, it really complicates some of these sensitive issues like immigration that really have bearing on the future composition of the nation or how our ideas of the nation might change in the future.
So Ryan, just follow. So how then do you design an assimilation process? What do you assimilate people into if we have these different conceptions of nationalism in a way that's meaningful other than merely becoming part of the current culture, which has no meaning?
Well, when you think about assimilation, there are lots of different ways to define it. One way to define it is simply that assimilation involves immigrants becoming more like natives, more like the average among natives, right? Here's the funny thing, though. The average among natives is a moving target, right? So let's say 100 years from now, the United States has experienced a huge amount of migration from Turkish Buddhists, okay? And the average American in the year 2150 is a Turkish-speaking Buddhist who loves doner kebab and, who just really loves the Buddha. Then assimilation in that narrow technical sense means that I'm assimilating to whatever happens to be the norm in this future America. There's another way of thinking about assimilation, which is that, it's to a culturally specific conception of American life, right? Assimilation is a segmented phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that means different things for members of different groups. So for example, let's say you're a Nigerian American and you come to the United States. You could assimilate into the African American community. That's pretty darn different from your Nigerian traditions, right? But that could be one way you enter the country. Or you could assimilate into, the Latino community through intermarriage and by embracing some different conception. There is an American mainstream, there is an American cultural majority, but fundamentally, the way one assimilates in Texas is going to be different from one how assimilates in New York. That doesn't mean that we don't want to encourage the idea of some kind of common culture, but it's simply a reality that, you are becoming more like a certain class of natives. But natives are pretty darn diverse, right? So that's going to look pretty different depending on circumstances. Now, someone like me thinks the idea of certain shared cultural ideals, shared cultural practices is really important for binding a country together. But in a nation of 330 million people, I've got to tell you, assimilation really is just going to look different depending on all sorts of other circumstances. And one of the big things that I focus on in this book is actually the way that class plays into this. So let's say you're someone who comes into the country, already you speak English, already you have a lot of education, already you find yourself surrounded by lots of other native-born Americans. You think of them as your neighbors and your friends. You think of them as fully part of your life. You might even marry one, right? That's a very different way of becoming an American than if you are someone who is really darn poor. You're someone who moves to an ethnic enclave surrounded by other people who look like you, who sound like you, who have similar skills and cultural traditions. Those people, both of them might assimilate in the sense of becoming more like people who are natives, but in really, really different ways, right? They're assimilating into different class groups. So I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Hi, my name is Jan Sidorova, and I'm from Reason Foundation. So you talked a little bit about how we need to grant amnesty to illegal immigrants who have been in the country for 10 years, but there's also a large population of people who have been in the country illegally, and for a lot of reasons they might not be even up for, it doesn't really mean they're gonna ever be granted citizenship or even a green card status. So how is that American that we grant a path to citizenship to all these people who have been here illegally, while there is tons of people who have been here legally, did everything correctly, have worked hard, paid taxes, did everything, and we don't even talk about them?
This is an incredibly helpful question. It's a helpful question because it illustrates these different conceptions of nationalism, right? So what our questioner has done is introduce an ideological conception of the nation. It would be un-American for us to embrace her specific policy proposal. This is something that Barack Obama, of course, did all the time, and people do, you say that, hey, if you favor a 70% top marginal tax rate, that is un-American, because America is a country that rewards hard work and enterprise, right? I mean, this is an argument that is very classically American, you could say. Now, I guess my view is that I have very, very specific views about exactly what our legal immigration system ought to look like. One pretty tricky issue we have is that if you look at, for example, employment-based green cards in the United States, they're offered in an incredibly arbitrary, opaque basis. So if you're someone who's in the country with an H-1B visa, that's a visa for high-skilled workers, your path to getting a green card can be incredibly winding, complicated, and crazy, and inconsistent in a way that can be really, really frustrating. I personally think that we ought to have a more transparent and predictable path that basically says to people, hey, look, these are the ingredients of labor market success. We want you to speak the language. We want you to be really incorporated into American culture. But we're not making this a totally arbitrary, crazy system. We're making it predictable, coherent, transparent. And I do write about this a fair bit in the book. But I personally think that when it comes to crafting an immigration compromise, emphasis on compromise, you have to do things that aren't purely based in my particular principles or ideals, right? If I could do that, I would be called a dictator, not a commentator on public affairs. So I guess when I'm thinking about this bargain, I'm certainly not saying, I'm actually pretty explicitly not saying, that it's going to satisfy everyone. It's going to be incredibly frustrating to many people. But what I hope to do is create some kind of rough and ready workable compromise that we can all live with. When you think about America's system of constitutional government, it's really incredible. It's very frustrating to progressives. Why? Because it requires broad overlapping majorities. You both have the House, then you've also got the Senate. You've got all of these different branches that create all of these different veto points. Now, if you're a progressive who wants to impose your vision of what a perfect, modern, social democratic America is going to look like, you find these veto points extremely frustrating, right? Hey, right now I've got my 51% majority. Why can't I ram everything I want through? Because the founders had this little thought. We want a broad overlapping majority for legislation, particularly on really central questions like immigration. So I promise you, there are literally dozens of people in this room who could come up with a beautiful, perfect, wonderful immigration scheme. But the nature of our system is that it's not about one faction imposing its will on everybody. It's about everyone taking their lumps and actually coming up with something that is going to create that broad overlapping majority.
Hi. About legal migration, we finally legitimate the term chain migration.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Chain migration. Yes. And rather than talking theoretically about nationalism and all that stuff, the fundamental thing is what is a good policy and how to legitimate it in a political discussion with the left. Everybody knows that every angry Democrat always moves to Canada for some reason, not to Guatemala. I don't understand why, if they want a southern border, but that's what they threaten to do. So Canada has a very important merit-based immigration system, but we say merit-based, but also the second component, which is very important, is a non-chain migration. So to immigrate to Canada, you have to collect points in a very clear system based on education, language, all that stuff, so they get the best and the brightest. But then, that's not what explained to the American public. You can go there, only you, your wife, and your kids. No mothers, no fathers, no brothers, no sisters, no cousins, and I think I'm still puzzled why the American right, or whatever you want to call the group who actually want this country to attract the best labor force that we can attract, does not embrace this kind of argument to say, let's be like Canada, without all these theories, because to me, that's a very strong argument.
So first of all, I advocate a move to a more skills-based immigration system, but there's a slight problem with your characterization of the Canadian system. So if you look at the Canadian system, it's true that they do have a points-based system for many migrants, but they actually also accept far more family migrants than the United States does. If the United States accepted as many migrants as Canada does for permanent visas, we would be accepting about 3 million every year rather than 1 million. I personally believe that Canada admits too many, but that's a whole separate conversation I'm happy to have. And if you look at the Canadian system, that's actually not quite right. So what they do is they actually give intending immigrants points for adaptability tied to having a relative in the country. I believe that that is a pretty sensible approach because it says that, okay, you have a sibling, let's say, and they do count siblings, by the way. You have that, and that can be factored in among many other considerations. So, when I think about what would be a sensible legal immigration system that could command broad majority support, I guess my starting point is that, maybe I would want to reduce levels, but there is not nearly enough public support for that. In fact, only about 30% of the public wants to reduce legal immigration levels. So what I would say is we can keep levels roughly steady, but what we'll do is this. We will modernize the existing employment-based categories to make them more like a point system that is predictable and sensible. And then we will take the family preference categories for siblings and what have you, and then we will say, no, this is also going to be a points-based system, but for these visas, you can get a small number of points for having a relative. I think that that seems like a sensible, moderate compromise. But the truth is that the Canadian system is certainly not perfect in every respect. We could certainly learn from it, but I wouldn't mimic it in every detail. There's more to say about that, but I'd be happy to discuss that with you further.
Thank you for coming and speaking again. So regarding the ethics of immigration, when you're considering two candidates, and is it proper to give merit to a more highly productive candidate? Does that insinuate any kind of ethical issues from your perspective, or one that you could empathize with? And does that create a wholly egalitarian method of bringing in immigrants, and why or why not?
So I basically, I don't think of this through the lens of moral philosophy. I really do try to think about this through the lens of practical politics. And from my perspective, if you look at the history of American immigration policy, we've always maintained a distinction between migrants who settle in the country on a humanitarian basis, refugees and asylum seekers, and other migrants. When it comes to those other migrants, for over 100 years, we've had a notion in American law called public charge status. And this idea of the public charge, this actually goes way further back in American history. If you look at the debates over immigration in the 19th century, we had really big conversations about keeping paupers out of the country, people who were so desperately poor that they would not be able to support themselves, but rather would depend on the charity of others. Now, that might not sound very friendly or humane, but that has always been a bedrock principle of American immigration law. Now, one thing that's happened in recent years is that many immigration advocates have in various ways blurred the distinction between humanitarian migration and non-humanitarian migration. And I think that this is a pretty big mistake. Because it really is true that, for a country like ours with a long history of welcoming the persecuted, there is some place for welcoming political refugees, folks who are fleeing religious persecution, in some reasonable numbers where we can actually accommodate this and we can incorporate people into our communities. But overall, immigration was seen as a means of building the country. And when you want to build the country, you're not thinking so much in humanitarian terms as thinking about who are people who will not just be self-sufficient, but who will be people who will be able to support their families and help build flourishing communities. Now, I happen not to find that idea offensive. I think that idea is pretty sensible. The idea that, yes, there's a place, a limited, bounded place for humanitarian considerations, but overall, I think it's pretty legitimate to say that our immigration system should serve the national interest, and particularly the interests of our existing citizens. Again, not everyone's going to agree on that, but I've got to tell you, of the vast majority of Americans, regardless of where they come down on the number of folks we ought to welcome into the country, do accept that basic premise that we have the right to decide what makes the most sense for us. And what makes the most sense for us, I would argue, changes from time to time. In the year 1910, it was very different from what it was in the year 2000 and what it's going to be in the year 2030. That's why I think that it's perfectly legitimate and sensible to say that we are going to shift those criteria over time. Now, you mentioned this idea of economic potential and whether it's legitimate to take that into account. When it comes to refugees, I think that, that really shouldn't be the chief consideration, right? There are a variety of other factors, including strategic considerations that might come into that. When it comes to migrants who are expected to support themselves, because again, the public charge doctrine is not something I made up today. It's something that's been a principle of American law for over a century. I think it's reasonable to take into account that person's economic potential. So, there's a lot more to say on this subject, but that's basically how I see it, and I'm happy to talk to you about it further.
Thank you for being here. I'm curious, in your opening statement, I think a second sentence, you mentioned about the Democrats' motivation was their offense, I guess, to the immorality of the wall. Yet, of course, they have walls and gates all around them. So is the consideration that perhaps it's to expand their voter base part of their motivation? And secondly, I had a question regarding the big business current day emphasis or preference for the cheap labor pool. If you could address that, please.
Sure. So if you're looking at that first point, I guess I find it helpful to try to inhabit people's perspectives. I might have a pretty cynical interpretation of what it is that Democrats want to do, but I think it's useful to try to put myself in their shoes. You know, it's certainly possible that there are a lot of Democrats out there who just really have a diabolical plan to take over the country, and that's why they kind of favor this or that policy. I'm sure that's true of some people, but I do think that there are a lot of people for whom they believe, they might be wrong, but they believe their views on immigration are rooted in some sense of what is just, what is good, and what is true. And you know, that could also relate to electoral politics. They might think that, you know, we will expand this majority to do things that we think are right, that are in keeping with our vision of what America ought to be. So even though I disagree with them pretty strongly, I do think that it's helpful for me to discipline my thinking by thinking about, you know, what's the best case for their perspective rather than the worst case. Now, when it comes to employers, this is a really, this is a subject that I think is that's not understood as well as it could be understood. So I think that when you think about the labor force, changing the labor force changes the way that employers do business. So for example, if you have a labor force that is highly educated and highly productive, you basically have to structure your business models differently than if you have a huge number of workers who don't have a lot of skills, right? So for example, if you have a country that has a very highly educated population, it's a lot more likely that you'll use machines to do a lot of back-breaking physical work than that you'll use huge armies of people. You know, if you have to pay high wages, that's another reason to economize on labor, right? When you think about American history, one of the reasons that this is the country that created interchangeable parts, you know, that innovated in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of labor-saving ways, it's partly because on the frontier, for example, you know, we didn't always have a huge abundance of labor. It led to the use of ingenuity and creativity. So when it comes to employers and their agenda, I would argue that different employers have pretty different agendas. If you're an employer who thinks that, hey, my labor force is mostly in China, you know, what I do here is I have some research and design and, you know, kind of, so you're not really worried as much about getting access to cheap labor, right? Maybe you're thinking, well, I just want to be sure that I can get the best engineers, for example. And the best engineers, they can be pretty expensive, but you're not as concerned about that. There are other businesses, however, where their business model would cease to exist without low-cost labor. So in that case, they might be really motivated to secure as much low-cost labor as they can, but I don't think that business is monolithic on this front. I think that you actually see really big divides among different kind of businesses depending on the business models they depend on. But you know, happy to discuss that at greater length.
Stu Reuter. I'd like to go back to the question you raised about sponsorship. I'm aged enough to realize that my father, after World War II, signed into the country any number of uncles, aunts, cousins, with the proviso that they would not be on welfare for 2 years. And a number of them slept on the living room couch for about 6 months until they could get their feet on the ground. When did that change?
This is a wonderful question, and it really speaks to a kind of revolution in the welfare state. So if you're looking at folks who secure green cards in the United States right now, unless you secured your status as a refugee or as an asylee, in those cases, you're immediately eligible for a wide swath of safety net benefits. If you aren't in one of those categories, you are subject to a temporary 5-year ban, it's called, on accessing a range of different safety net benefits. But that ban has a lot of holes running through it. You know, for one thing, if you have kids, they're not subject to that ban, right? It's subject to the actual, you know, kind of initiating person, the adult. And then there's the fact that there are all sorts of things that are not technically safety net benefits that really function as safety net benefits. For example, the Earned Income Tax Credit. The Earned Income Tax Credit is a provision of the tax code which says that if your wages fall below a certain level, you will get a refund check, quote unquote, from Uncle Sam that is designed to defray payroll taxes or more than that. But that is something that really makes a big difference for a lot of folks, and it's, you could argue, a kind of welfare, right? So in that case, you are immediately eligible for that. And it's kind of a funny thing, because people who say that we have a desperate need for lots of low-skill, low-wage labor, what they don't acknowledge is that, well, if we had such a desperate need for it, clearly the wages would be somewhat higher, right? We wouldn't need the earned income tax credit and other refundable tax credits to really top up people's incomes. So I think that that is a really tricky thing. There are some people who say that, oh, these immigrants, they're lazy, they don't want to work. No, I mean, they're immigrants who do work. The problem is that in many cases, their skills are such that they can't really command high enough incomes to support themselves and their families. Now, the Trump administration has proposed revising the public charge status, basically revising how we think of what makes you a public charge or not. Right now, the rules we have on the books are rules that were established by Bill Clinton in 1999. And under those rules, you're really only considered a public charge if you get all of your income from cash welfare, or if you're literally being institutionalized. But if you collect, if you rely on Medicaid, if you, collect SNAP, if you collect the EITC, it's all of these other things, you wouldn't count as a public charge. President Trump has said, let's try to fix that. Let's try to have a more modern and, some would argue, sensible conception of what it means to be a public charge, which says that we have this expectation that you are going to support yourself. Now, to the point about families, here's a hilarious story. So under federal law, since 1996, if you are sponsoring a relative, you really are responsible. And if that relative does collect a safety net benefit, the public sector has the right to engage in sponsor recovery, to collect money from the person who sponsored that immigrant. Guess what? Sponsor recovery has never, ever happened. Mike Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, tried to do it. He asked for a voluntary contribution from folks who sponsored immigrants. And he collected, in a city of 8.5 million people, he collected about $500,000. When Bill de Blasio came back into office, he said, this is an outrage, and he returned the money. So basically, this thing that is literally on the books is never enforced. And whenever anyone talks about enforcing this very basic common sense provision, they're run out of town on a rail. The idea is that this is some kind of terrible, awful thing. Now, there was one proposal Republicans in the House proposed in the Goodlatte bill. What they said is, right now, if you are the parent of a U.S. citizen, you can enter the country without limit. It's an unlimited number of folks who can come. Now, again, if you're the parent of a U.S. citizen, you might be an elderly person. You might be an elderly person who needs a nursing home. You might be someone who relies not just on Medicare, but also on Medicaid and a variety of other benefits. Now, there are some kind of limits on that here and there, but, fundamentally, we ought to do, in my opinion, what the Canadians do. What the Canadians say is that you can bring your adult parent, that's great, you're a wonderful person, congratulations for being such a dutiful child, but it's going to be on a temporary, renewable 5-year visa, and you only keep the visa if you purchase health insurance for that parent. Now, to me, that seems like a pretty sensible idea. We're not saying you cannot bring the relative. What we're saying is that you must be held responsible. If you're going to be so wonderfully generous, well, be wonderfully generous, right? And I do think that bringing that principle back into our immigration system that you describe would make a world of difference. And by the way, I just want to stress, there are some sponsors who take their responsibilities seriously, but there are a whole heck of a lot of others who aren't even educated about what their responsibility is and what it means. Law serves a tutelary function. When we do not enforce some of these laws, we send people a very bad message that these laws are to be ignored, they're not to be taken seriously, that this supposed responsibility is really just a piece of paper. And that also has lots of negative consequences for how we think about assimilation.
Thanks for coming. On late night TV, there's often a lot of skits that are comedic of the man on the street that doesn't understand civics, history, or social studies, whatever you want to talk about it. You've used the word assimilation so many times tonight, but you haven't mentioned specifically how the people that are here illegally that you want to keep here can assimilate and understand the trouble that those people behind you went through to craft the Constitution, to understand the Constitution, and to abide by the Constitution. What are your specific ideas?
Well, sure. There are many different pieces to your question. One is this question of civic education for all Americans, whether they're foreign-born or native-born. I've got to tell you, I think that civic education for native-born folks is not where it ought to be, in my humble opinion. And I do think this is something we need to invest in and take seriously. When it comes to unauthorized migrants, you know, I've got to say, I think that this population is a population that is aging very rapidly. You are talking about a population where the share that is over the age of 50 is growing enormously. And, you know, by the time you're looking at, 10 or 15 years from now, you're going to look at folks who are not really the seedbed of the next generation. These are not people who are going to be shaping our civic life. Unfortunately or fortunately, kind of whatever your view on this is, these are folks who oftentimes have spent, most of their adult lives in the United States. They've done it in very low-wage work. They've done it really toiling in the shadows. They've done it without any kind of big idea of taking part in our civic life. If you look at that older Amnesty from 1986 we talked about at the beginning of the Q&A session, one of the really striking things is that of the roughly 3 million folks who were legalized, actually huge numbers of them never became naturalized citizens. You actually had a wave of them who became naturalized citizens in 96. Why is that? Because in 96 you started talking about, well, one hypothesis is that you started talking about limiting safety net benefits for folks who weren't citizens. So then there was like an immediate visceral reason to kind of get involved in the political fray. But there's a huge number of people, they just wanted the legal status. They weren't thinking, I want to vote in elections or something like that. They just, wanted to be assured that they're not going to get kicked out of the country. That's not necessarily a good thing, but when we're thinking about the practical, on-the-ground realities of that, that's one thing to keep in mind. And when you're thinking about folks who are granted some kind of legal status, one way to do that is to say that, okay, if you came into the country as a minor, then, okay, maybe you might eventually become a citizen. But if you did not come into the country as a minor, there are a lot of folks who might say, well, I don't think it's entirely fair to say that that person ought to jump ahead of many other people who entered the country lawfully to become a citizen, right? That doesn't mean that civic education doesn't matter, but it does present a different set of questions and challenges. I'd be happy to talk to you about that further, but look, I agree with you 100%. Civic education matters a huge amount. It absolutely matters for immigrants, but I do believe that this is a problem that's not a niche issue that just applies to this one group of folks. It applies to all Americans. It is the duty of all of us to teach our children about our constitutional ideals, to make sure that they continue to be defended and cherished for future generations. Thank you very much.